welcome to Work Life Leader Live. Thank you for joining me. I'm Julie Cohen, CEO of Work Life Leader and an executive coach. And I'm thrilled you're here, either watching live or are recording. This is the first episode of the Work Life Leader Live book group. This is something I've been wanting to do for some time. And about a month ago, I finally found the book that I felt was a great way to launch this. And we're going to be talking about the book, No Rules Rules, Netflix and the Culture of Reinvention. And before we start the discussion, I want to introduce you to the person who's going to be joining me on this adventure. So want to say hello to Steve Schack. Hi, Steve.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. It's good to see you. And I want to formally introduce you. This will probably be, this is the only time I'm going to be reading something, but I want to kind of let people know how awesome you are and how thrilled I was that you were going to join me in reading the book and talking about it. So Steve Schack brings 20 years experience to his work as a coach to both individual executives and teams. His clients include CEOs, business owners, and corporate executives, and come from a wide variety of business settings. Steve previously worked as a senior manager at Ernst & Young and later at Capgemini in the business transformation consulting practice. And we share Ernst & Young and Capgemini in our history. And while he was there, he built an exemplary record of achievement working with Fortune 100 clients and their executives on issues ranging from leadership development, business transformation, and driving sustainable change. While at Capgemini, Steve was also responsible for the people management area within his practice group and was responsible for coaching and mentoring colleagues. So he is, when he told me he had read the book, I knew he'd be a great person to have this discussion with. So again, welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so just a brief intro of why this book. So No Rules Rules, Netflix and the Culture of Reinvention is written by Reed Hastings and Erin Meyer. And for those of you who don't know what it looks like, this is the book. And I have many pages with lots of things outlined. But I was walking one morning listening to a podcast. Actually, I think it was Freakonomics. It might have been Freakonomics. And Reed Hastings was being interviewed, and I was really struck by the nuances and details of how he has developed the Netflix culture. There were a lot of things I'd heard about, over the years when Netflix has made kind of the news around no vacation policy and some other things. But hearing this cohesive kind of theories and processes and rules of how they operate, no rules rules, it made me want to go deeper. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And I want to just get started by turning it over to Steve and just giving your, before we talk about the book, icebreaker. We always start with an icebreaker. I forgot. I almost dove right into it. So since we're talking about Netflix, I thought, Steve, we could both share what we're watching on Netflix right now, what we're loving on Netflix or not loving.
Sure. No, I was actually, we're almost through a show called The Queen's Gambit, which is one that, talk about needing to stay curious. That's one where everyone who described it, it didn't sound at all appealing to me based on how they were describing it. And yet I thought everybody can't be wrong. And I'm completely addicted to the show. So I think tonight might be the final episode because trying not to stream too many in one day.
Oh, wow. So you're not a binge watcher. You're more of
I typically am, but I try to sort of limit when it's a really good show. I try to sort of let it go slower.
Awesome. Well, I'm watching 3 at the same time. We actually just finished The Queen's Gambit. I won't spoil anything. The other 2 shows we're watching concurrently, one is The Crown. We just are going to start the 4th season of The Crown. And something that I've never imagined I would watch is called Drive to Survive, which is about Formula One racing. And it is captivating. It's a documentary, and my son, my 18-year-old, is enamored with Formula One, and I can see why. It's really exciting. So I encourage you to do that. So with that, now we're going to start talking about the book for those of you who are ready. before Steve talks about, he's going to give his general thoughts on the book, and then we're going to really drill down and talk about concepts. I want to see who's here. If you're watching live, and we are on Thursday, December 3rd, 4 p.m. Eastern, a little after 4 p.m. Eastern. If you're here live, please put in the comments, say hello, use hashtag live. We want this to be very interactive. We're going to just kick things off, and then we're going to be asking to hear from you, your thoughts, your questions, your challenges, what you liked about the book, if you read it, what things you think are credible in your organization if you read it. If you haven't read it, as we talk more about it, we definitely want to hear your thoughts about things you think could work in your organization or things you think will never work in your organization. So let us know you're here. Say hello. We love getting questions, comments. Please engage with us. All right, Steve, finally, tell me, what did you think of the book?
I really enjoyed it. I thought that, first of all, it was very clearly laid out, a very simple model to follow, which for me is like, I think a lot of business books tend to need an editor that they never had. So this one actually had proper editing. So as a book, I think it flowed really nicely. I think there are a lot of really good examples, and they present a sort of a compelling and provocative concept for how to run an organization, or how to take a fresh look at organizational design, organizational development, human resources. So in a lot of ways, I think it sort of broke some new ground, reinforced some things I was thinking, and caused me to have some new thinking about certain things. So to me, that's the sign of a really good and interesting book.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I found myself, again, I knew I was reading it to also talk about it, but I think even if I wasn't going to be talking about it, I took 6 pages of notes of things to remember. And I, as a coach and someone who works in organizations and often partners with human resources, around leadership and effectiveness, I found so many things that I was excited about. And then I also said, can this work anywhere else besides Netflix? So I think there's lots of things that people can take, bits and pieces that people can experiment with. But once we start introducing them, let's talk about what you think may or may not work, in organizations, what organizations need to do to make those things work, and what things, are only going to work at Netflix. So I see we have a couple folks here. I want to say hello to Sharon Levenger. I'm glad you're here. Bill Hyman, a regular viewer. Hi, Bill. And Karen Borland. Good to see you. Welcome. So again, please introduce yourself if you're here. Ask questions. If you've read the book, can you let us know you've read it? Or if you're just curious, or there's something you love about Netflix, or something you hate about Netflix, or heard about Netflix, we want to know what you're curious about. But how we're going to start our conversation now is there are 5 core concepts of, and actually I shared this in the event, but there are 5 concepts that Netflix used it's on their culture page. It's in their job section on their website, and it talks about their culture, and it's literally listed as what is special about Netflix is how much and these are the 5 things. So we're going to actually just look at these at a high level, and then we're going to eventually drill down into all these. So the first item that they do differently than a lot of organizations, and again, not all organizations, is first encourage independent decision-making by employees. So, all right, Steve, what do you think about that? And how real is that? What does that look like in traditional organizations?
That's one of those ones that, I did a lot of work like in pharmaceuticals. We've lived in an accounting firm before. We've worked in accounting firms. That's one where I look at it and go, it's some interesting concept, but it has limited application in some industries, some markets where you're tightly regulated, or there are process rules and oversight and accountability and paperwork and SOPs that need to be dealt with. So I think that's one where I certainly like the idea of moving sort of those non-regulated decisions, if you will, to that point. But it's not the sort of blanket applicability that you would see in like a creative business like Netflix.
And I think you bring up a really good point. A lot, and the authors, Hastings and Meyer, they stress that this culture and this set of no rules works because this is a very creative industry where innovation is the primary driver. A lot of these rules will not work in a highly regulated, organization. They gave examples, like you talked about, lots of examples. You don't want an innovative, air traffic controller. You don't want an innovative surgeon, at least while they're performing their operation. There's a set of rules, and everyone needs to make sure they're following all those rules. So that's definitely a disclaimer for this. So let's see, just again, to reintroduce, this is Work Life Leader Live, our first book group. We're talking about Netflix, the book about the Netflix Culture of Innovation, No Rules. And one of their first tenets is encourage independent decision-making by employees. And I guess another feature about this was employees at all levels, employees, regardless. And there's also this issue of the comment of an informed captain, so that the decision makers, they have to get as much information. You could be a director, a manager, a project manager, and you make that decision based on the information you have, and you don't have to get approval by your boss. So anything that struck you on that?
Again, I think, there are certainly team structures. I work a lot with building teams, and what we really encourage is to get real clarity about how those decisions get made, and to encourage them to be as democratic as possible, but also not to have everything filter up through the hierarchy. And I think that's certainly something, as you see more organizations built around teams as opposed to sort of more traditional or old-fashioned structures, it becomes really important that those people know what the swim lanes are that they have authority over, and then really encourage people even at a relatively junior level to make decisions. And I think the reverse is, we've seen what happens when organizations are sort of overly sort of matrixed up to the hierarchy, where people are afraid to make any decision, even a minor one.
And they talk about in the book how much those, and we're going to talk about rules, but how much those those standard operating procedures and the hierarchy really not only minimizes innovation and creativity, it slows business down. And Netflix needs to be very quick to stay up with the trends. There was a great story about I can't remember what it was, a documentary. It was one of I don't know if it was a manager or a director. He had buying power of what was supposed to be a very hot documentary, and Netflix wanted to buy the rights for it. And they were going to pay a certain amount. They thought, maybe $1.5 or $2 million. They thought that would be great. It turned out there ended up being a bidding war, and he was nervous about, do I spend this much? But the decision had to be made very quickly. And his boss just gave him context and let him go. And, we won't tell you the end of the story, but that was a perfect example. His boss he probably wanted an answer from his boss, but his boss wouldn't give him the answer. So that is very, I find that to be obviously very out of the ordinary in most of the organizations that I work with or coach people with in any capacity. So let's look at the second tenet, which is share information openly, broadly, and deliberately. So how does that show up at Netflix? What did you think of that?
Well, I think that's another one where, it makes all the sense in the world. Clearly, there are issues around certain things that are perhaps confidential for a reason, like around individuals or around products or intellectual property. But this concept of really making it a very open organization where everybody knows what's going on and everybody understands the pieces that they're not a part of becomes really critical as you grow.
Right.
So I think I've dealt with a lot of organizations as they get bigger. It reaches this point where nobody knows what the other departments are doing, and nobody really understands the big picture after a while. So this one, to me, I thought had wide applicability.
Yeah, and there's so many nuanced levels there. They talk about people know everyone's salary. The books, the financials are open and clear. and strategy is open and clear. And one thing that I really enjoyed about this, which I think is interesting, is that there have been some situations in which this has gone wrong, where there has been, quote unquote, corruption, or people have done things that, have broken trust, and they have a very clear response to that. They address it with the person, and they call it sunshine it. They actually turn, a spotlight on that, and are very clear with what happened, and they don't all of a sudden, restrict.
Yeah. It also reminded me, I think my first job, I was in my 20s, was working in at that time, Arthur Young, if you can remember how far back that goes. And we were doing government contracted work. And therefore who was the junior person typing up a proposal, needed to know everybody's actual income or salary, because it was government contracts. So they were paid based on a multiple of that. And it just struck me as bizarre that here I was knowing everybody's salary in the room. And yet the flip side was it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like everybody was so competitive or eager to know. So I think to some extent, this openness kind of breathes a fresh air into the organization.
Yeah. And I do think, and I'll be curious. So let's pause and ask a question. So, folks who are watching us, I'm curious your thoughts on working in an environment where everything is open, so people then can make decisions based on all the facts. So if you're watching and you're in an organization where this is part of the culture, we'd love to hear how it works. If you hear this and are thinking, oh my God, I would never want my team to know everything, tell us that too, because there are organizations where this would be very antithetical to how they operate. So we want to hear both sides. Open the book, sharing things. All information to help run the business is open, except, there are some like personnel issues and legal, but not salary, and not if someone is let go. That is always clear too. So, and we'll talk about that a little. I definitely want to drill into that. So, but before we move to the third item, I have a comment here from Sharon Levenger. Thank you, Sharon. Her question is, do you think old school mentality versus new world innovative mindset can clash within organizations? So, Steve, what do you think?
Absolutely. So I think this is where the change process winds up being really important. If you have this kind of a hybrid model where you have the sort of old guard and new guard, or you have parts of the organization that can be this sort of innovative and others that are by required or perhaps are appropriately more restrictive, it can easily create, friction between the two sides.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that is why this can be successful at Netflix is this is ingrained in the culture. It is clear from the beginning. If you go to the website and you read this page is extremely long. It lists, besides these tenets, it lists the values and the concepts and the type of people they want. So it is a very specific type of person who is going to thrive in this environment. So I think it has to be very clear expectations. And then the other piece is the culture is nurtured so much, like everything is discussed, and these tenets are constantly reinforced, and they're reinforced top down, bottom up, peer to peer. And this actually leads us to the next of the third of the five tenets that are really important to making the Netflix culture unique. Is they are extraordinarily candid with each other, and they call it what do they call it? Something candor. Say what you really think with positive intent. And so they have rules around it, but it is, again, part of the culture that you see something that's not working or that you think will risk any part of the business. It is actually it is part of your job responsibility to be clear. They teach people how to be candid in a way that's respectful. But that candidness happens all levels. It doesn't matter if you're, 5 steps or 5 tiers away from the CEO. If you're in a meeting and he's doing something that you think is damaging, it is your responsibility to speak up. I think this one is hard. What?
This one takes a lot of practice and a lot of culture change in some organizations, but this is one that I spend a lot of my career doing or helping organizations to put in feedback models and practice that feedback. You and I as coaches probably spend a lot of time with our clients on how to deliver feedback and how to accept feedback in an appropriate way. And this is one that I've certainly seen in my own experience in organizations, where once you have that culture where everybody is really free and open and eager to share, it creates a level of awareness that you couldn't possibly have any other way.
Yeah.
And an accountability that goes along with it, that anybody can, as you say, raise their hand and say, something's not right here, or I have a better way. And as long as they do it respectfully and with positive intent, which I think is one of the key things that Hastings talks about as well. That to me really makes a difference, but it is not easy to make as a sort of a habit, if you will.
Yeah, and this is a way they address this is, well, there's many ways, but one of the things I think that really is an important theme in most of these concepts is they stress that this needs to happen top down, and that every manager needs to be asking their direct reports for feedback, and they need to be asking for it and taking it in a way that role models how to respond. They have a model, they call it the 4A feedback guidelines. Mm-hmm. It's actually like the GIFT model for Work-Life Leader, which we have.
Very similar. Did you notice that, huh?
Yeah, I noticed a lot of stuff. I was like, wait, I've had this for a long time. But they call it the 4A feedback guidelines, and it's aimed to assist, make the feedback actionable, appreciate the feedback, and accept or discard. Just because you get feedback, it doesn't mean you have to listen to it. So you always have a choice in what you do with that candid information. So I think so. Let's pause and ask any questions, anything that strikes you. How comfortable would you be in providing extraordinary candidness to everyone you work with? How comfortable would you be receiving it from all layers of where you work? What do you think? How would that serve you and your ability to do your job? How might it hamper you? So those are some things to think about. We'd love to hear your thoughts so far about what you've heard, anything that strikes you or excites you or concerns you about the culture.
Give us some candid feedback. Give us some 4A feedback.
That's great. So the fourth item is keep only our highly effective people. So they call this they want to have stunning colleagues, and they call it talent density. They want high talent density. So basically everyone at Netflix is a star performer. Realistic? What do you think, Steve?
It may be realistic when you have the kind of capitalization that they have. So is it realistic? Possibly in certain industries in a very kind of limited setting. Is it realistic in most organizations? Probably not. And does it create some challenges? I think it certainly does, in terms of how do you run an organization as large as this and constantly have that. Really, they don't have high turnover, but I'm sure that they did at some point, right, on the way to getting there. And I think this one for me raised a lot of questions. As much as I like the concept of if people don't belong there, and if it's not the right fit for them, and they're not really able to sort of maximize their potential, then why are we wasting their time? And so I like again, it's conceptually, I like it. It's in practice that I think there are more challenges and questions than may be apparent.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah. So this one definitely, and for our shared roots at Ernst & Young, where we worked in the management consulting group, that is another type of organization where, high talent is very critical. So, one of the things I loved many things when I worked, at Ernst & Young. But one of the things was, just about everyone was, outside of Ernst & Young, outside of the management consulting group, would have been identified as top talent. And so the excitement was you always knew you were dealing with really smart, really fast, really capable people. The challenge there sometimes was, we did have a forced ranking system. And so that was one thing that Netflix is very clear at. The expectation is, it was one of the slides from the culture deck that started this whole book was, adequate performance gets generous severance package. And so that, to me, from an HR standpoint, there's the amount of time, if you know someone is not going to work in your organization, spending 3, 6, 12 months on a performance plan to get them to a place where they're adequate versus giving them a generous severance package and helping them find the next right opportunity for them actually makes a lot of sense from a time, energy, and attention standpoint, which kind of leads us to, when we get to this, the final of the 5 points, is you don't have to have as much HR structure and talent development structure if you do hire just the most effective people. So it's tricky. Yeah. I'd be curious for you, the folks who are here. I know you have something to say. Hold that for 1 second. Yeah. Reintroduce. We'd love to hear from you. This is the Work Life Leader Live book group. We are discussing, we've read No Rules, Netflix, and I have to go reverse. Netflix and the Culture of Reinvention by Hastings and Erin Meyer. We're discussing that book. I'm with Steve Schack, executive coach, and we're going to be delving deeper, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on these key concepts. Keep only our highly effective people is what we're talking about now. Please put your questions, comments, your experience, or if you're a contrarian on this, if you think, no, that doesn't work, we want to hear your thoughts. So please share in the chat box. Steve, you were going to say something, and I
was just going to say, I think, to me, if I change the word high potential versus high effectiveness, to me, that opens it up a little bit more, particularly now when we're dealing with how do you create a more diverse workforce? How do you bring people in and develop them who are perhaps not necessarily walking in the door with the kind of expertise that you'd want? So to me, it's a more expansive view of this that conceptually is very similar, but really opens the door to saying, okay, we really want just the highly, high potential people that can grow into those highly effective folks, but we're prepared to invest our time and resources into developing them. Yeah. That, I think, both makes your organization more successful in the long run because you can bring in those folks that maybe aren't right now stars, but have the potential to grow into it. I'm wondering whether you, from an HR background, sort of experience that similarly.
Well, it's funny. I was looking at some of the people who are on here, and I was actually going to see if they're still here and get some of their thoughts, because one of the person who introduced herself, she works in kind of in the career coaching space. Another person who's here, I know, works in university careers. See, there's also an HR professional on here. Again, I can't see everybody. If you don't say hello, I don't know you're here. So if you're here and in a role of HR, in the career space, if you manage a team, what do you think about that concept of really just nurturing the not actually even nurturing, it's keeping the best and not investing a lot of time nurturing someone who is not at that top tier level. I think, Steve, you actually brought this point up to me, and we can kind of go on to this point, because I think it's really important. If you have this, you open my eyes that this does not necessarily work very well if you are trying to create a more diverse environment and really honor kind of some inclusion, some diversity and inclusion concepts. So do you want to maybe expand on that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what I mentioned earlier, which is if you're basically saying everybody has to walk in as a star, and it assumes that they've all had the same opportunity to become stars, either it's innate sort of talent, or more often it's based on their work performance and the experience they've been able to develop. So it seems to me that would limit you to people that have already had the kind of opportunity that a Netflix type of organization might provide. And therefore, I think it makes more sense to say, we really want to develop a pool because we see the strength of having a diverse workforce, and therefore we're going to invest in those high potential people and develop them into a highly effective team of contributors.
Yeah.
So like I said, I love the ideal of saying we only want the strongest performers, and we're prepared to invest our time and resources into building that team,
Yeah.
as long as you walk in with the ready, willing, and able to do the work, to get there.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you're spot on, and that really, another thing that was said in the book, they don't have, they don't have a training and development. They don't do a lot of that. They assume each individual will, go to their boss and say, I need this training. This will help the business, enable me to do this. So, where, obviously the work you and I do, we go into organizations and we help support leaders to be more effective. My guess is they don't use a lot of outside folks like us because we don't know the culture, and we don't know, it's not an investment that they need, because if they're hiring right and everyone keeps rising,
Right. But to this point, I mean, I have an organization that's a client now. It's a small investment company where the two principals really don't have the time to invest in training or developing people. And what they find is they're hiring people that may often be sort of high potential, but not currently performing at that 5 out of 5 level. And they get frustrated because those people are not developing. And I said, well, you don't have the time to develop them. So you really need, in that case, you need to bring in people that are already 5s. And so you have to be honest with yourself of how much time and energy can we, and are we prepared to actually dedicate to developing people. And if not, then I love this idea. And I've had these hard conversations with that very client over a couple of hires that they've had where, solid performers, but they're not 5s, they're 4s instead of 5s. And it's like, you said you need 5s, you are prepared to pay for 5s, and you're not prepared to develop 5s, and therefore you should only keep 5s. And the generous severance is the right strategy for anybody who's not a 5. So I think if they read this book, they'd see a lot in it for them that could be applicable in this category.
Right. Agreed. So let me go to the final tenet, and then we'll get specific and see what questions and comments we have. So the final of these 5, kind of themes and how they operate is they avoid rules. So, the big, I remember when this came out, it was like, it had to be at least 10 years ago. Maybe it was like was it the late 2000s, maybe 2008, 2009. It made all the news, or at least the news that I watched, since I read a lot about careers and work and things like that. But, Netflix did not have a vacation policy, and they were very clear about the semantics. It wasn't no vacation policy because they were afraid people would read that, okay, don't take vacation. They don't have a policy to regulate vacation. And so they leave that to each individual person to work the hours they want and to take vacation when they want. And so Reed Hastings, he tells a great story in the book about, he would have 2 different nightmares, kind of alternating nightmares, when he and the chief people officer kind of rolled out this policy. One was that he would go into the office one day and no one would be there. Everyone took vacation on the same day, and no one was watching the store. The other flip side was that I think he called it zombies, that he created these some kind of zombies because there was no vacation policy. Everyone felt they couldn't take vacation. So people were just working 24/7. So fortunately that never happened. But because the way that they've been able to implement it is, when they started it, they put the expectation that the most senior people need to take big vacations and scream about them. And they would have slideshows, and they'd put photos all over. And anytime they were away, they would let people know, and they would shut down completely. So that was a way for, if the senior leaders were doing it, then their direct reports and the direct reports and the direct reports were seeing, okay, my boss is doing this, so I can give it a go. So that was just one set of rules that they got rid of that worked. And then after they got comfortable with the vacation policy, they expanded. And in the book, there's a list of like 10 or 12 policies that they don't have that most companies have. So what did you think of this, the vacation policy? Did any of the other policies, kind of...
The expense one surprised me.
Yeah,
Didn't they have they have no
about
expense limits, right?
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that?
That's an interesting one. Having been a consultant on the road for many years, I think we all would have enjoyed that one at times, because we were pretty good about running up expenses with a policy in place.
Right.
So this is one that, I think that there are certainly things to take away from it in terms of not creating unnecessary rules. And I think a lot of organizations instinctively go there of thinking they need a policy, they need a restriction, and they never ask themselves, what's the actual cost of that? Meaning the cost of putting in that limit, the cost of creating that kind of afraid to make decisions or inexperienced making decisions kind of culture that you create. So in that sense, I certainly agree. And then I think I was talking to you earlier about when I did work in pharmaceuticals, which is a very sort of pharmaceutical drug development, which is a very slow moving, risk averse kind of, process driven, organization. It's really hard to get people to think in new ways. And I remember we once had a big global group in talking about how to do drug clinical development. And the people that were most innovative were these people from Eastern Europe. And we asked at one point, what makes you more basically more innovative? And the answer was because we've never been told what we couldn't do. We've never been told we couldn't do X or Y. And so they were just coming with sort of a fresh, they might call it a naive or even an ignorant perspective, not as a pejorative, but just as a reality.
Right.
And so I think there's a lot to be said for not sort of putting artificial limits on things without really thinking through, like, what is the real cost? Like if we don't have vacation limits, what's the real cost? That one or two people might take a week or two more than we thought they would. Okay, but what would be the benefit of the other 100 people not having to deal with, filling out timesheets and getting requests for approvals and all of the stuff that people go through?
Yeah. And that, that leads to a bunch of other concepts. They're all coming back to me, but he told a good story about this, that kind of similar to what you're talking about, that, kind of decision making and not having to follow certain rules is that, again, in the pace is really critical. So, it's interesting because you give the example of a slow moving industry that, you don't necessarily think of as creative, that there's a lot of rules that happen, but still, obviously in drug development in the pharmaceutical space, there's a lot of innovation needs to happen. And so, it's probably finding the right way to innovate without, in a regulatory environment that's even more tricky.
This concept of like, do we really need this rule? For what reason? And is the benefit of the rule actually outweigh several times over the cost of it? Because if the answer is no, then I don't really see why the rule needs to be in place. And I recall for example, not having any sick days. I don't know whether that was the official policy, but that was the way it was understood. It was like, if you're sick, you don't go to work. We're all adults here. That was often the preface, right? It was, we're all adults here. And yet a lot of organizations don't really treat their adults like adults.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like being back in grade school. You have to bring a note if you're out a certain amount of time. Yeah. And I think, again, it kind of creates its own kind of cultural reinforcement when you have too many rules. And so when I do work, particularly with smaller organizations, I always say, like, you have the chance to design carefully, as opposed to just having just because you're getting bigger doesn't mean you need to start putting in rules and procedures and, signed processes unless they're absolutely essential.
Yeah. And that's something that, again, the book stressed, is that, people thought, oh yeah, we can have all these crazy no rules when we're small. Will we be able to do it while they're growing? And Netflix has been able to do that. They're now in, I don't know how, they talked about how many countries, I can't remember how many countries, but they're now a global organization. Mm-hmm. They've had to do some adaptation outside of of the U.S., but these core premises are pretty intact, and they haven't had to throw out any of these concepts because they exhibit and reinforce these behaviors. We got a couple comments. Actually, it's funny. They're back to some of the stuff around talent density. Bill Hyman said, in Good to Great, Collins talks about the importance of having the right people in the right job. He didn't read the Netflix book, but did they talk about if an employee was not a 5, perhaps finding another role that would allow them to be a 5? I'm trying to think.
Not a heck of a lot. Meaning, I'm sure they do some of that, because anytime you read a book, there's usually kind of some more discretion in the reality of how things are being run deep in an organization. But they certainly didn't emphasize that, and I think that's a really good point, because a lot of people, you and I know this from our coaching work, are put into a role or in a relationship where it's just not working, and they do have the potential. That's where I go back to, if they have the potential to be great, either in a different organization or in your organization or in a different part of your organization, then I take that kind of more of the servant leadership model to say it's our job to help them be great.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. They used, Reed Hastings gave a story, an analogy, which again, I think it's insightful. He used the model of the profession. They looked at Netflix as a professional sports team, as opposed to a family. He reflected that a lot of companies, to kind of keep that kind of good vibe at the organization. Okay, we're a family. There's a concept of loyalty, and we care about you and your career path here at the organization. They found that family model was not conducive to their concept of talent density, because if someone doesn't have that high talent, that level of talent that they want, if they're family, you're going to keep them on, because you don't want to send grandma out on the street because she can't kind of keep up. I'm teasing about that, but that was kind of the concept, where from a professional sports team standpoint, people go to the game. And Bill Hyman, I know you, and you'll understand this, they use the baseball analogy. On a baseball team, every person has a position, and they're expected to be at the top of the game at all times. If they provide training and coaching, but it's up to that individual to keep up their skills, to keep their body well, to keep themselves healthy. And over time, if they fall, they will be booted off the team. And it's about the business. And so that is kind of part of that concept is what's good for the business, what's good. The overall team takes precedence than the individual players. And so people understand that there's sometimes sacrifices that are going to be made in order to keep the team performing at that level. So I think Bill, again, from the book perspective, they did not stress that. They do not invest in bringing people up, because they hire for very specific roles and very specific skills, and they pay top dollar. That's something I want to get to, but I see there's so much to talk about. We have a couple more comments. If there's interest, we might have to do a part 2, because this could have been a 2 or 3 hour conversation, because there's so much interesting stuff. So Sharon Levenger says, many of my clients feel the pressure to keep up with being high performance. Yet companies are changing directions to sustain being relevant in the market, such as the IT industry. And I think this ties to this of why Netflix operates this way, because they feel they need to be cutting edge, and so they don't have time to make people high performers if they're going to keep at the top of the market. I mean, is that what you kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of the sort of market necessity in the sector they're in, and it's also the resources they have, which is extremely rare to have basically unlimited cash, which is what they have. I mean, people make jokes about how Netflix will just hear a story in an elevator and decide to make a 10-part series out of it, because they have nothing but money. And not a lot of our clients in reality have the level of resources that they have. But I go back to the analogy you made before about the baseball team or the football team. They have 30 or 40 really strong, performers, then they have thousands of people, or at least several hundred in the organization overall. And not all of them have to be at that level, and nor are all of them paid anywhere near the kind of ridiculous or very high salaries that you would see among, the wide receiver. And so I think taking their model and saying, how would you build a football team? Yes. But how would you build a football organization? It then becomes a little less clear cut, because you're dealing with, the people in the finance department, and the people that are parking the cars, and the people that are picking the vendors, and not all of them can be paid at that level, and not all of them necessarily have the same incentive. And so I think, this issue around being, staying somewhere relative to where the market is, there's a reality to that as well.
Yeah, I want to address that, because I find this really, really, really interesting. The concept around some of their salary, and they couple things. One of their themes is pay the top of the market, and I got to say, when I was in HR, I've been out of corporate HR for now 20 years, so it's been a long time. So this isn't my area of expertise anymore, but one of my biggest frustrations, and this was happening in the height of the .com era in the 90s, late 90s, when I was in that role, is we were losing our best and brightest folks to Silicon Valley, maybe to Netflix, to salaries that we couldn't compete with. And what would happen over and over again, people would come to me and my colleagues, and they'd be so frustrated. They said, they'd say, oh, I just got an offer from so-and-so. Can you guys match it? Then they would match it. But people would be frustrated about their salary for months or years. Why am I only getting this bonus? Why am I only getting this raise? Why am I? And so there was this constant, tension around, in order for me to get to that next level, I actually have to leave my company, or at least do a thorough job search, so I can show my market value, and they'll raise my salary. So Netflix takes that completely out of the equation. So there's no energy and frustration around this. That if they're at Netflix, they're getting paid top of the market at that moment. And what was really interesting is I actually used this with a client soon after I read it, was make sure, Reed Hastings talks about this, take the calls from the headhunters. It's your responsibility to understand what your value is to the market is, and tell your manager, so we don't lose you. And so that, to me, is, and that relates to transparency and this high talent density. They don't want to lose their people, and they will pay at the top of the market. The other thing that they believe in is big salary, no bonus. They don't do any kind of bonuses. They get as much money for what they get it all in salary. And so there's no incentive to, they expect people to work at a certain level. So it's not like, oh, if I work harder, I get more. It's, you should be working at this consistent high level, and we're going to honor you with this really big salary. So I think their salary process is really for creative, innovative, for creativity and innovation. It's very inspiring. One other thing that, kind of building on what you said, there are certain areas where they don't do this. It's not every, accounting and, some of this stuff, some of the rules are different for certain positions, for more of their, traditional roles that, are less, less innovative type and less creative people. So
yeah. So that's why I think, the model that they give you is more akin to the sort of professional sports team. But regarding the salary, which is not, that's not my space of expertise from an HR perspective, but the idea of paying top, not waiting for people to come to you to ask for basically the market rate for what they are, is a really smart move. And I think we've both dealt with this, probably as coaches. We've dealt with both the people doing the hiring as well as the people that are saying, I really think I should be looking elsewhere because I've consistently been passed over, or, I know people are being brought in for more money than I am, or I'm already paid below the market. And, the fact that they would then have to make the effort to try to get their number up to where it needs to be, as you say, at the very least, it leaves a bad taste. In some cases, you've just lost the person.
Yeah.
And
Right.
we see it a lot, and it's often people you can afford to lose the least.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly right. So this comment actually can lead us into some of our final thoughts. But Justin Ratcliffe, hello, Justin. Hope you're okay. He makes a great comment, is that he sees considerable value in using the principles to help a company's board in considering a roadmap to a more open corporate culture. So I guess I'm going to use this as kind of a summary question. Steve, like if you think about, is there, what's the one main idea? Now there's so many ideas. Is there an idea that strikes you as something that really can help, change culture, expand to a more open culture, something that would kind of give you, some of the benefits of what works at Netflix? Would there be one thing that stood out for you that you would encourage an organization to experiment with?
I think there are a lot of ideas, but if I had to pick one, I would say the candor piece, the feedback and the candor, because that's one that I just don't see a lot of in organizations, particularly candor upward. And I think, as you and I are in the business of coaching a lot of those leaders that have those teams, they would really benefit from getting very clear feedback and from having a culture where people really do say what's on their mind. Often in coaching, we say that we describe it as, coaching is basically getting people to finish one conversation. And I think in this case, candor actually allows organizations to have those difficult conversations. And those often get in the way of them really being able to kind of take themselves to the next level. So if I had to say one thing that's almost universally applicable, no matter what your business or nonprofit, for-profit, small or large, I'd say that's the one.
Yeah.
What about you?
It's hard. It's funny. If we're just looking at those 5 tenets that we talked about, again, I'm a believer in the candor, so I see that. But I'll just give, since I'm not just going to say, yeah, what he said, I'll just share. But that I think goes up at the top would be this: encourage independent decision making. Mm-hmm. I think a top-down, hierarchical, approval-based culture, leads to stagnation. Now, obviously, there's some positions in some industries where, like we talked about earlier, that have to be that way because of, safety or regulation. But, in 20 years of working with my clients, the ones thrive, the ones that are, if they're the right talent, if they're at that higher level of performance, if they're not given some leeway and not given the ability to make decisions, they will feel stagnant. They will feel not valued, and that is an easy way. And we missed. There's so many things we didn't talk about lead with context, not control. Mm-hmm. So if managers are giving their direct reports the context to work in, then it becomes easy to let them make decisions. I think when people take more ownership in any decision they have to make, they're going to be invested way more in the success than if they're just following rules. So I think that I put there.
Yeah.
So,
and another one that applies to just about any organization. Yeah. You don't have to be a Netflix and with their bank account.
Yeah. So as a summary, I want to say that I think I would encourage everyone who manages people, who runs a project, who runs a team, who's an HR, who is an organizational leader. You can read this book. It's an interesting read, whether you're not one of those roles. For any person, it's a really interesting read. But there are a lot of things that you could do pretty easily to experiment with some new behaviors that might enhance how you relate with your the people you work with, and enhance the overall, whether it's team culture or organizational culture. So I encourage you to read it. Any last comments that you want to?
No, I agree. And like I said, it's, and I can't say this enough because, we read a lot of business books. This one actually is well written and flows well. And it reminds, like Good to Great, I think, was a really well written book. So similarly, I think this one not only has a lot of good concepts that can be used in a practical way, but it's actually written in a way that's compelling and tells a really interesting story about a company that I knew very little about other than what I saw on their channel. Yeah. So that was really informative.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Steve. If someone wants to talk to you, what's the way for them to reach you? What's the best way to
They can reach me at my last name, Schack, at clearblueassociates.com. And they can also go to my website, www.clearblueassociates.com.
Awesome. Steve's awesome. Thank you all. This book from two of us, it definitely gets 2 thumbs up. So it would get 5 stars on Netflix. And thanks for everyone who is watching live or is watching at another time. We will revisit comments, any new comments. We love your thoughts. And we'll see you next time. Actually, tomorrow, noon Eastern, Friday, December 4th, noon Eastern. I have another Work-Life Leader Live. My guest is Rick Gardner, and we're going to be talking about executive coaching, our brains, and habits. We're going to be looking at neuroscience. So please join in. We'll see you there. And thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.